I want to begin the project of making the 3-inch color and report shell, the report often referred to as a bottom shot, which is the first real shell illustrated and described in Fulcanelli 2. First thing I need to do is make 2 spolettes, one with a 3/4 inch powder core for the bottom shot. Into that tube, 3/4 inches, I add 13/16. That's to use this jig and drill bit, which I've described elsewhere. And then I want a 1-inch spolette. Fulcanelli says you can either use a 1-inch or 1.25 inches. I like a 1-inch for about a 3-second delay on the main shell timer. 1 inch plus 13/16. And I'll cut those 2 tubes. And those are the 2 tubes for my spolette, the short one for the bottom shot, the longer one for the main shell timer. And now using the 0.3 cc powder scoop from the Lee Reloading powder scoop set. That works nicely for introducing powder into the spolettes and ramming powder that ends up being 1/8 inch tall when it's done. I'll ram the powder in there to within 1/2 inch at the end of the tube. On each of those spolettes. And this is the second spolette, the longer one, which will have the actual 1-inch powder charge for the main shell timer. Looks like one more increment. That's now full to within 1/2 inch of the end. I'll put the powder away. And then using the jig, put the jig on the hollow end of the spolette. And then I drill in to the mark on the jig, which ends up having 1/4 inch of the powder grain drilled back. That provides really nice positive fire transfer to the inside of the shell when the spolette burns into that drilled powder grain core. And that is now drilled back that 1/4 inch. This is the second spolette, back drilling the hollow end of the spolette 1/4 inch. And that second spolette is now back drilled to 1/4 inch. Put that powder back in here. So there are the two spolettes with the solid powder core ends and the back drilled hollow powder core ends. I have these nice cap plugs I got from McMaster-Carr, which just fit the ends of these spolettes snugly. I'll use these over the flush outside powder core ends to protect them while I'm pasting and spiking the shells. To match and to nose the spolettes, I've got some nice thin match which just fits down into that drilled core in the hollow end of the splet. I'll leave that match sticking out about 1.25 inches. Then I'm going to fill the rest of that void with a bunch of match, the same, sticking out the same distance. And then I like to nose the spolette with 2 turns of 3/4 inch craft gummed tape glued around the perimeter of the spolette tube and then tied around the match and pierced in 2 locations with a sharp awl per Fulcanelli's recommendations. Both of those hollow ends are now filled with the match, with the first strand going down into the hollow core, drilled core. Now I'll just put 2 turns of the gum tape on there, lapping onto the tube about 1/4 inch, so there's about 1/2 inch extending past the end of the tube, which will be crimped around the black match. And I'll put a clove hitch with this waxed linen twine around that nosing to really secure the match in place. And when that fire hits that match, that's going to spit a huge amount of fire to the inside of the shell. And I just pierce that nosing in 2 places, right at the top of the tube there, and there's a finished spolette. And there are those 2 matched and nosed spolettes ready to be inserted into the end discs that they'll be used in. The longer spolette gets glued into the single disc, the single thickness disc. I will glue that in until that nosing is right up against the bottom inside of the disc. And I'll make sure there's a nice fillet of glue around there. Then I'll add a fillet of glue to the outside joint. And I'll set those aside to dry. And now both of those spolettes are glued into their respective single and double layer discs with good glue joints inside and outside. I'll be filling the salute, the bottom shot, from the actually upside down. I want to glue the spolette fused disc onto the casing first, then I'll fill it with flash and I'll cap it off with a solid disc. This can be done either way, but I prefer to do it this way. Fulcanelli says if you're making a whole bunch of these, you can fill a little tray with white glue, just dunk the bottom of the casing into the glue and then glue the disc on. So glue that on. I like to finish off such glued joints between discs and casings with a strip of gummed tape. It holds the disc on while the glue is drying, and in my mind adds just a little more flame protection. Apply a little saliva to the tape. And that's ready to fill with flash. Bottom shot can always be made with black powder report composition with a little titanium in it too. It doesn't have to be flash. Black powder in a spiked thick wall casing like this will make a pretty good boom too. One of these bottom shot, 3-inch bottom shot casings will hold about 2 ounces, about 60 grams of flash composition. We'll fill that up. That's if it's pre-mixed. I would only use about 2/3 to 3/4 that much, maybe 40 to 50 grams, 40 to 45 grams, if I was mixing it binary and wanted to leave a little space in there, which is the safest way to mix flash. But I'll show mixing this flash using the diaper method, which is the least hazardous way of mixing flash in the open like this, and that's enough to just fill this casing to the top. So I have pre-weighed my ingredients per the flash composition for salutes and bottom shots formula. I have pre-weighed the 4 ingredients, and I'm going to put through my little 40 mesh kitchen colander the oxidizer, just breaking up its clumps on a piece of paper that can be used to diaper mix it. Then I'll add the metal fuel. Those are the only 2 ingredients I'll put through the screen in order to break up their clumps. Those 2 ingredients make flash powder. And then for bulking that up, which is recommended by Fulcanelli to keep it from packing down and speed up the flame propagation through it, also cheapens the mix just a little bit, makes it a little less expensive to make. I've added some rice hulls. You can add bran, the kind of bran that's used to make bran muffins, and then some titanium for some titanium sparks. This is sponge titanium. So I've got all my ingredients on the quote diaper, the piece of paper I'll use to diaper it. Now it's just a matter of rolling it back and forth like this. Naturally now I'm making just about the most powerful composition we make in fireworking. So all this has to be done in an extremely safe location, away from sources of ignition. It's not a bad idea if it's a very dry day, or if you're working in a very dry, low humidity environment, to spray this whole area and yourself with some static guard. I happen to work in a very humid location, so I don't experience static discharge sparks. But if there's any doubt about that, spray this with a little static guard. But after a couple minutes of doing this, this becomes a homogeneous looking mixture. No white oxidizer showing anymore. It all looks nice and evenly mixed. So I've exposed this to no screening. I would never screen this with the titanium in there in the first place, but even the oxidizer and the metal fuel. I have not exposed this to any screening, no sources of friction or impact. This is about as gentle a way as you can mix flash composition. Now I will pour that into my salute casing. So I will put my salute casing on a little stand on a separate piece of paper and just gently pour this into the salute casing. One little trick that helps, since this is going to be a glue joint here between the casing and the final end disc, I really don't want flash powder on there. So I've made a little bit of a shield out of a disc that has a large hole punched in the center. That just shields that upper edge of the casing from any excess flash powder that might get spilled on it. And I'll just gently pour the flash powder in there, getting it about as full as possible, and then just settling the flash powder in there a little bit. And I'll put the balance of my powder in there. The advantage of working on a sheet of paper is that can then be picked up. Any excess that's spilled into that can be put onto the first piece of paper. Working on a couple sheets of paper can really reduce the mess that any spills make. And just that little bit of excess will go right into the casing. And I'm ready to glue my end disc on. Glue my final end disc on with a real good bead of glue. I'll put a band of the 1-inch craft gum tape on there, like I did on the top disc, the fused disc. And then that filled casing will be ready to spike. Put a little sprayed paper on here. My tongue's a little dry. And there's a filled bottom shot ready for spiking. Now to spike the report, it should be spiked with 12 verticals. It's pretty easy to mark a 12 vertical pattern. I just put a line going straight down the side of salute to keep them lined up. And I'll put a mark there. Let's say that's 6 o'clock. I'll put a mark at 12 o'clock. I'll put a mark at 3 o'clock. I'll put a mark at 9 o'clock. And then I'll divide each of those spaces into thirds. It's about 5/8 and 5/8. About 5/8 and 5/8. Falconelli says that this spiking is just really to hold the end discs on really nice and securely as the pressure builds up inside the report to create a nice explosion. So on the bottom, lining up with the marks on the top using that side line I drew, put a mark at 6 and 12 and 3 and 9, and then split those spaces into thirds. The spiking will be 2 strands, 12 verticals, 2 strands, 8-ply cotton string. In this particular case, hemp or flax could be used, but in this case I'll use 8-ply cotton string, 2 strands. I've done a little calculating, and for this, the string will pass the top disc 6 times, the bottom disc 6 times, which is 12 times 2.5 inches, that's 30 inches. 12 verticals, 3 inches tall, is 36 inches. That's 66 inches divided by 12 inches. It's about 5.5 feet. So I'm going to put 6 to 7 wraps back and forth on my spiking horse, which will equal that 6 feet or so of pasted spiking string that I want. I like to paste my string with Elmer's glue, but wheat paste is more traditionally used. Pre-mixed wallpaper paste would work fine. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That'll be plenty. Now it's important, once again according to Falconelli, that this top joint, makes a lot of sense, this top joint be really well glued to keep any fire from that first color break from getting in to this joint. So I'm really putting a nice bead of glue around there, and I'm going to put a clove hitch with my pasted spiking string around there, really mash it down into that glue to create a nice seal at that top. And now that that top has that nice glued, packed oakum, as the plumbers would call it, packing in there, I will just do off-center spiking on this, coming off the fuse, going to right of center on the bottom of the shell, going to left of center on the fused end of the shell. Fuse and left have the same number of letters. Doing the off-center spiking. No horizontal spiking is applied to this so that the circumference doesn't get built up any larger than necessary, and so the spiking on the color break when it's added the vertical spiking can fit right between these verticals on this shell. So there's the completed pattern on the top of the shell, the completed pattern on the bottom of the shell. The spiking's nice and tight. Now I will put 2 half hitches around the spolette and pull them nice and tight. Once again, that adds to that seal around the top of the shell. I'm going to pack that spiking down with a piece of tube, and I'm going to add just a little more glue around that to create a nice conical glued packed seal around that spolette where it enters that disc. And I'll set this aside to dry. Once it's dry, I'll paste the bottom shot in. I got 3 6.5 inch by 9 inch sheets of 40-pound paper to put 3 turns of pasted paper on the bottom shot. Put plenty of paste on there. I've cut the paper. The grain is running in the direction of the 6.5 inch dimension. It's just long enough to lap up onto the spolette right to the bottom of the cap plug cap, and to cover, lap onto the bottom of the report almost all the way, almost the full width, not quite. That'll reinforce the bottom nicely to take the lift charge wallop, and will lap up and form a nice crown around the spolette while still allowing me to have plenty of bare spolette to tie the match onto to fuse that spolette. So I'll start the paper right with enough lapping over the top to create that crown on the top around the spolette. Now I'm just going to put these 3 turns on one at a time, since Fulcanelli specs twisting that crown down around the spolette 1 turn at a time, like that. That is lapping up onto the spolette nicely. And I will tear and pleat the bottom paper down as I normally do. And I'll put all 3 of these pieces of paper on there, which will create 3 nice solid turns of pasted paper around the spolette to fireproof it. And then I'll dry that really well when it's done. And this is the third turn of paper. The vertical spiking on that report is really obvious. That's creating a nice conical seal around that split to shed the flame around from that area when the color break goes on this, because this top of this report is right in the bottom of that color break construction, the way this will be built. And I'll dry this for a few hours till it's completely dry, or overnight, and then proceed with the color break construction. This bottom shot is actually used as the case former on which to roll the casing for that color break, which is actually the first break in the shell. And that's a pretty, I'm going to put just a little extra paste around this top to get it nice and slippery and wet, and then really pack down that crown so that's really nice and well crowned and twisted around that spolette now. I'll go dry that. The paste strap on that bottom shot's nice and dry now. That crown is really nicely sealed around the spolette. Now it's time to match that exterior end of the spolette. Remove the cap plug. Take and scrape that black powder grain so it's got a nice fresh surface that'll take fire easily. Now I'm going to scrape a groove right across the surface of that powder grain with a sharp awl, about an eighth of an inch, I'm sorry, about a 1/16 of an inch deep. Really allow that fresh surface to take fire. Now I want to take match coming up from the end of the spolette about an inch, going up, so that's lapped down onto the side of the spolette, across the spolette, down. This is much easier said than done. And then back up. So I've got rabbit ears sticking up off the spolette with the match coming down across the spolette. trim off the excess. Then put a clove hitch of tarred string or wax string around that match to really hold it in place nicely. Get everything nice and even before I pull that clove hitch tight. And make that tight that knot really tight, so there's no way that match can be dislodged from the end of that spolette. So that's really nicely matched on the end. When the fire comes down and bursts that color break, that will guarantee this spolette takes fire. Following Fulcanelli's directions for rolling the case for the color break onto the salute, using the salute, the bottom shot, as the case former, I've cut 2 pieces of 55-pound paper, 8 inches wide by 18 inches long. Each of those is long enough to make 2 turns around the report. I want 4 turns of this 55-pound paper to equal to what 3 turns of 70-pound paper, which would be 210, 220 pounds of paper on there. So I want a total of 4 turns of this 55-pound paper. I put the salute on there with enough, there's going to be enough paper overhanging to pleat onto a bottom disc once that's installed. And there's enough, since this is 8 inches wide, there's enough paper overhanging the top of the report to create a 2.5 or 2 3/4 inch tall color break, and then pleat the paper over onto that top disc of the color break, the fused, the disc that has the spolette in it. So now I'll just start rolling this paper up very nice and tight, keeping it aligned so the edges stay nice and aligned. I can always adjust that a little bit as needed. Roll this up nice and tight. I like to put just a little bit of glue where the report is to glue that those first 2 turns onto itself. Then I'll start with the second strip of paper to put the next 2 turns of paper on there. Once again, making sure the edges stay nice and aligned. And I'll just put a little glue right where the report is to keep those turns glued to themselves nice and tight. Now Fulcanelli says to stand that assembly up with the bottom facing upward. Sprinkle in a little bran, sawdust. I use rice hulls because I've got them. What I'm trying to do is create a nice level bottom for a disc to sit against, so the bottom ends up nice and flat with just the bulging, rounded bottom of the bottom shot peeking through there just a little bit. Then I'll slide a disc down in there. It's handy to, I can actually push the report down just a little bit so I've got enough paper hanging there. It's handy to use a piece of 2-inch PVC now up inside those turns of paper with the top of the bottom shot sitting on that piece of pipe so that the bottom shot can't be pushed down inside these wraps. The way I like to pleat the paper at the end of a break is to put a smear of white glue around the end disc and then just start pleating that first inner turn of paper down. pleating it as I go until that first complete turn is pleated down. Then I'll mash that flat with the end of a wood dowel, or in this case the piston from a 1-inch Comet pump. So that first turn is pleated down. I'll repeat that until I have all the turns pleated down. That's going to give me a nice flat, solid bottom to this whole assembly. That paper's pleating over onto the end disc about 3/4 of an inch to an inch. And this is the fourth and final turn of that paper now. And then it's, if you were doing this Fulcanelli's way, I'd wait to put the bottom disc on, and the bottom disc would be held on for the spiking that's applied to this brake. I like to go ahead and glue on the end disc now and finish it off with a strip of gummed craft paper tape. That way that bottom's all finished and ready to spike. And that now has a casing which has been rolled onto the bottom shot. That has a casing ready to be filled in a normal way for any color brake, either with cut stars and a cannule filled with burst charge, and then some filler powder in there. In this particular case, I have some 1/2-inch pumped brilliant multicolor stars. I'm going to make a stacked Comet brake atop this bottom shot. But there's a nice square solid bottom to that assembly. And there's the top of the bottom shot in there, ready to have a color brake built on top of it. Now I'm going to stack these 1/2-inch pumped and primed brilliant color variegated stars in stacked Comet fashion, like for a stacked Comet brake, on top of the outer portion of the bottom shot. Just one ring, then I'll stack another ring. First of all, after I get one ring in there, I'll fill those interstices along the outer wall with fine pulveron rammed in with the end of a bamboo skewer. And then I will stack a second ring, staggered, not directly over the first ring stars, but staggered like building a brick wall. And I'll fill those interstices, and I'll repeat that until I've got this filled, probably with 5 rings, which will be about 2 3/4 inches tall. I want the inside diameter of this brake is 2.5 inches, maybe just a little more with the spiking on that 2.5-inch diameter bottom shot cam. So I want the height of the fill to be about the same as the diameter, 2.5 inches. There I've got a ring of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 stars. Now I'll fill into those outer spaces with the fine pulveron, sort of settled in there and then pushed in with the end of the bamboo skewer. The goal is to have this be an extremely solid fill of these rings of stars once they're all in there. And I'll just repeat that until the shell is filled with those 5 rings, about 2 3/4 inches tall. This will be the last ring of the stars now. This is when, to me, this whole method of construction becomes, it's pretty fun. It's I don't know, it's sort of like building a little model of something. It's a small shell, but it has a lot going on. It should be a pretty burst of brilliant multicolor stars. Fairly large stars for a 3. These 1/2-inch stars will be pretty bright and pretty large, with a large flame envelope for a 3-inch shell. And then after those stars just start to burn out, the bottom shot will go right at a little less than 3 seconds after the color shell burst. The bottom shot will go off, the titanium spark, titanium salute report bottom shot. And it's kind of a fun process when the whole assembly starts to come together into a real solid, precisely made assembly. Once again, not a big shell by any means, but a fun one to learn the essentials of this first level of multi-break shell construction on. I've been pondering what I'm going to break this shell with. If it was a little larger, if it was a 4-inch, I'd probably use hot black powder on rice hulls, perhaps with a little bit of the Spanish booster in it, although I'm not sure I'd want to use the booster in a shell that has the bottom shot in it. I don't want to burst the top of that bottom shot and set it off prematurely. I do want to make sure its fuse ignites very reliably. So I'm thinking that just a black powder burst. So if it was a little larger, I'd use just a black powder on rice hull burst, but on a small shell like this, I like to lean more toward getting as much black powder in there as possible. So I think I'm going to use hot granulated black powder, Eastern red cedar charcoal, with a hot granulated black powder burst. That works best for me when I'm making single break cylinder or ball shells, so I think I'll stick with that in this shell. Naturally, I've got to fit the spolette from the top fuse, the top disc that's fused with the spolette into that burst, which is a little tricky. I'm going to dump out all the extra pulverum, and there are the 5 layers of those stars laid in there like bricks. Now I'll fill that central void with my black powder granulated burst. Now I've got this hot Eastern red cedar, alcohol only, no binder, bound black powder, which is a hot black powder. I'm going to settle that nicely into the burst core of the shell. The ears from the fuse on that bottom shot are sticking up nicely, just ready to grab fire when the spolette from that first main shell timer burns through into the shell. I want to leave the top layer on this just a little bit loose so I can nestle the spolette and the matched spolette end down into that. I also want to add just a little bit of extra here to level off the top of the shell. Now that's good and level. I'm going to create just a little bit of a depression in that burst charge. To nestle that spolette down into. Ah, yeah, nice. And that has settled down into that burst charge very nicely. And that's become very solid in there. Close up my black powder, get it out of here. Now, holding that disc down, that whole construction feels really nice and solid. No shaking going on in there, very nice and solid. Now I will glue with the brush and glue, pleat that down and put a final end disc on there with glue down and also with a strip of gum tape around the perimeter. And then once this end is closed off, nice and tightly sealed, it'll be ready for spiking. Spiking will have 12 verticals. The verticals on this spiking application will fit in between the verticals, the ribs where the verticals are on that bottom shot construction, so as to not enlarge the diameter any more than necessary. And the horizontal spiking, Falconelli shows only horizontal spiking on just the color break portion of the shell. There's no need for horizontal spiking on the bottom shot portion of the construction. And here's the last turn to be glued down on the top of the shell. Even though the top of the shell, since this will be fused up for lifting out of the mortar, the top of the shell is not exposed to a huge quantity of pressurized gases like the top of the bottom shot will be. Still a darn good idea to make sure this whole top of the shell is sealed very well away from those lift gases. I'll put a little extra glue around the circumference of the spolette and then ram the, not ram, but push the punched end disc down around that. Put a bead of glue around the disc and spolette for an added little seal, and I'll put my strip of gum tape around the perimeter of the disc and casing where they meet, and that'll be ready for spiking. Very nice solid shell construction. No, nothing loose in there. Tight, solid construction all the way around its circumference. marks, ready for spiking. Preparing this for spiking in a similar fashion to the bottom shot. I've got the seam in my paper running vertically, so I just put a mark top and bottom to keep the marks aligned. I'll put a mark at 6 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 1/3 of the way in between each of those marks. And those will be my spiking alignment marks. I'll do a quick calculation to see how much string I need to paste for spiking this shell. A little calculating shows that this shell will use about 16 feet of spiking, the verticals and the horizontals on this spiking run. So I'm going to put about, just to be on the safe side, I'm going to put about 18 passes of the string pasted on my horse. That should be enough spiking string for this pass. I'll start with a little fresh bead of glue around the base of the spolette to ensure that glue seal there. And I'll do my off-center spiking pretty much the same way as before, except I will be applying horizontals where the color break is on the shell. Sort of making sure my spiking is laying off the side of the spiking on that bottom shot. And this is the last pass of verticals. Now spiral down, cinch it to one side of one of the verticals and spiral it down right to the top of the bottom shot. And I can sort of feel where the top of that spiking is on the bottom shot right there. So that's where I'll start to go straight around with a horizontal. Cinch that in. I'm going to put another couple of, you'll often see this done right between breaks, a few horizontals laid side by side just to create a nice band there that strips the paper and spiking off. Sort of splits it off right there when the color break goes. So I've got 4 to 5 horizontals running side by side right there now. Now I'll start to spiral up and create the squares in the spiking pattern with the horizontals as far apart as the verticals are from each other. Spiral up to the top of the color break, cinch it off with a couple half inches, and dry this before pasting it tomorrow. And there's a nicely spiked 3-inch color and report. I will once again shove the spiking down where the spolette enters the top of the shell, and then I'll just put a little extra glue in that area. And let that dry thoroughly before pasting it. The spiking on the shell is nice and dry now, so it's time to paste it. Fulcanelli specs 3 turns of 40-pound paper. 1 turn takes a little less than 9 inches, so 9 inches will make a nice turn of paper around that. And in order to lap, I'll paste this in a way that's similar to the way the bottom shot was pasted. I'll lap the paper up onto the spolette just about to the bottom of where the cap plug is coming, which will leave a ½ inch of the spolette exposed for tying match onto. And bringing that down and lapping it almost all the way across the bottom of the shell. A 10-inch piece of paper, 10 inches tall by 9 inches around, will work well. So I've cut 3 pieces of 40-pound paper, 9 inches wide, 10 inches tall. This is the direction it came off the roll, so the grain is running in the 10-inch direction. And I will just paste this paper with the wallpaper paste and break the paper by crumpling it up the same as before. I found, for my purposes, this pre-mixed universal wallpaper paste, which I got from Home Depot. Works very nicely for pasting shells. I've got plenty of the dry wheat paste I can use too, but for small one-off projects like this where I just need a little bit of paste, this works very well. So there I've got my 3 pieces of paper pasted and broken. Now I'll just apply a little extra paste to the shell to make sure it sticks. Make sure the pasted paper adheres to it really nicely. Lay the paper out in the right direction so that the 10-inch direction runs from the spolette down to the bottom of the shell. And start the paper so it just laps up onto the spolette to the bottom of that cap plug like that. Twist it down around the top of the shell and around the split. And I'll tear and pleat the bottom paper like I did before. And I'll repeat this 3 times and then dry the shell, and it'll be ready for lifting and leadering. Philip Canelli specifies 1.5 ounces of commercial 2FA powder. So if that needs to be homemade or anything, now would be the time to prepare some good lift powder for the shell. And I'll put the next 2 sheets of paper on there, and that'll be ready to dry. And here's the 3rd turn of paper. In terms of the bottom of the shell, which is going to take the bulk of the lift charge forces, it's easy to envision that between this paste application, the second spiking that was put on the main shell, the paper that was put on to create the casing for the main shell, the color break, the spiking under that casing, the 2 discs involved in the main color shell construction, the double disc involved in the bottom shot construction. There's probably a good 1/2 inch of solid padding underneath the flash sitting in that bottom shot, which is a heck of a nice solid support for that bottom shot and the flash inside. As long as that's all really nicely, tightly sealed the way this is, that bottom will take the force of the lift charge in the mortar very nicely without any breaches in it, without allowing any lift gases into that bottom shot. The last thing we want is a bottom shot going off in the mortar when the shell's lifted. So there's a very nice solid bottom construction, gosh, a good 1/2 inch to 3/4 inches thick under that bottom shot. And in a similar manner, all of this seal around that top spolette is really nice and solid. Once this is dry, that's a very nice, solid, gas-proof construction. So I'll dry that for a few hours or overnight before lifting and leadering it. The paste wrap on the shell is now rock hard, very solid, nice and dry. So I'll lift and leader it. First step in that, similar to what we did with the bottom shot, is to scrape that spolette powder grain end until it's got a nice fresh surface on it. Put a nice 1/16 inch deep groove in the end of that spolette. It's always a good idea to prepare for an incident, even if it's never happened and you hope it never happens. I'm scratching this, God forbid that powder ignites for some reason. I've got officially about 3 seconds to drop this shell and get out of the shop. I get away from anything that ignites as fast as possible. So there's a nice scratched, fresh powder grain and in the end of that spolette. Now I want to cut a piece of quick match long enough to lap over one side of the spolette, around the top of the spolette, down the other side, down the side of the shell, and almost clear across the bottom of the shell, which is that far right there. And now I will remove the pipe over that section of black match or quick match that goes across the top of the spolette and tie that over the top of the spolette with a very, very tight clove hitch of the waxed string, pasted string, regular string, glued to the spolette tube can be used as well. I'll lap the black match across the top of the split and down the two sides like that. Put a clove hitch of the wax string on there. The advantage of the wax string is that once it's pulled tight into a knot, it really grips onto itself. It doesn't let go easily at all. And now I'll just put a couple pieces, pushing that quick match over against the corner of the split in the top of the shell. I'll put a piece of masking tape across there and another piece down here just to hold it in place temporarily. Now I want to bare the black match and this quick match for the section that goes across the bottom of the shell, like so. Now I want to install a bucket, 3 turns of 40-pound paper around a 3/4 inch dowel former. This will be glued and tied to the top of the split, covering that pass-fire black match end at the top, and eventually, as a final step, the shell leader will be glued and tied into this bucket. I'll put a little bit of glue on the sides of the spolette above and below the tie, holding that pass-fire black match in place. Shove the bucket over that whole assembly. The idea of this bucket is to completely cover all that black match that was exposed at the top of the shell. And then I'll put a clove hitch of the wax string around that bucket below the location where that tie is, holding the match to the top of the split. That really locks, between the glue and this tie, that really locks that bucket in place. And just temporarily, while I'm doing the rest of this operation, I'm going to crimp and fold the bucket over just to protect the top of that split and the match on it during the following operations. Now a 10 by 18 piece of 40-pound craft paper, enough to cover the sides of the shell, plus lapping down off the bottom of the shell enough to contain the lift charge and fold over around and onto the lift charge. And this is that's 10 inches tall by 18 inches wide, which is enough for 2 turns around the shell. I'm going to paste just that section that will be on the shell itself, which is about the upper 2/3 of the piece of paper. I don't want to paste the bottom part of the paper. I don't want that to get hard and crispy. Now I will paste that around the shell. And that protects the pacifier as it goes down along the shell. And it creates a lift powder wrap, which once this paper is dry will be filled with the lift charge and then folded and finished off. And I'll let that dry until it's completely dry. The lift wrap is nice and dry now. I have weighed out 1.5 ounces of good quality 2FA lift charge, which I'm going to pour down into the end of the shell lift wrap. To fold the lift wrap over onto the lift charge, the pacifier is coming up on this side, so the black match coming into the bottom of the shell is there. I want to fold that black match down against the lift charge by taking the first fold, the inner fold of the lift wrap, and fold that over that first turn. Then I'll go around and repeat that, going on around until the bottom is nicely folded over on itself, completely enclosing and containing that lift charge. Now to create the patch that's going to go over that bottom, I'm going to create a disc out of a piece of the craft paper. Large enough in diameter to cover the bottom and lap up onto the sides, about 1 inch. That'll get pasted over the bottom of the lift wrap. I'm going to just apply a little bit of paste, and I do apply paste to both sides of this bottom patch because I want it to stick to itself when it's applied. Now, it won't stick to itself if it's dry on the one side. And I'll just apply that patch. This is called the bottom patch finish, or I think it's been called the Jersey or New Jersey finish. The bottom line is it leaves no glowing paper in the shell once the shell's fired from the mortar. So that patch is on there. Now I'm just going to paste a 3.5 by 10 inch piece of paper to cover the edges of that bottom patch keep them from coming loose in handling. And once again, I'll let that dry. Then the last step will just be to open up the bucket and install a leader shell leader coming down into the shell. To install the final leader into the shell, this is how long a standard 3-inch mortar is. With the shell against the mortar, I know I need a leader that long coming down into the bucket around the spolette in order to get the leader up and out of the gun, whether I'm electrically firing or putting a piece of visco fuse in there to hand light it. So I'm going to put just a little bit of glue on the side of the quick match leader. I've opened up the bucket and I've ensured that it's open going right down to the top of the spolette. I'm going to shove this down in there with plenty of that black match exposed at the end of the leader, hitting the top of the spolette. And I'll just put a couple ties of good string around that bucket. The last thing we want is the leader and or the bucket coming loose and out or loose and away from the top of the shell when the shell is being lowered into the mortar. So that's why I'm very careful and particular about the gluing and the tying of the leader into the bucket onto the spolette. I want to be able to dangle that shell nicely from the leader as it's being lowered into the shell. If it was a real heavy shell, I'd have a lift string on it or a lift rope on it, but a light shell like this. And then that's ready to have an electric match or a piece of visco taped and tied into the end of the leader. But that's basically ready to take out and shoot.